Have you ever wondered what it actually looks like when a zero-day vulnerability gets disclosed with no patch available? What happens when a security researcher does everything right, reports responsibly, waits patiently, and the vendor simply goes silent for 10 weeks? That's exactly what happened this week with Gogs, a self-hosted Git service used by thousands of organizations worldwide. And that's just one of 4 significant Linux security stories we're covering today. Here's what you need to know. There is an unpatched remote code execution vulnerability sitting in your Gogs instance right now, if you're running one. Samba just received a critical update that patches actual remote code execution in its printing subsystem. The Linux kernel has a new use after free vulnerability in the procfs subsystem that was published to the NVD on June 3rd. And CISA formally added a container escape vulnerability to its Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog, with a federal patching deadline that already passed. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what each of these vulnerabilities does, who is affected, and critically, what you need to run on your systems today to close these gaps. We'll also answer a question that comes up every time a zero-day drops with no vendor response. When do you migrate away from a project entirely? Let's start with the one that has no fix. Gogs is a self-hosted Git service written in Go. It's lightweight, easy to deploy, and it's been widely adopted in enterprise development pipelines, research institutions, and government networks. If you wanted a private GitHub alternative that you could run on your own infrastructure without depending on a cloud provider, Gogs was a very reasonable choice. Was, past tense, because on May 28, Rapid7 publicly disclosed a critical remote code execution vulnerability after 10 weeks of silence from the Gogs maintainers. The CVSS score is 9.4, that's critical, and there is still no patch. Here's how it works. When you enable the rebase before merging option in a Gogs repository, the server internally calls git rebase to integrate a feature branch into the target branch. The problem is that Gogs passes the branch name directly into that git command without sanitizing it. An attacker creates a branch with a name that starts with --exec equals and then pushes a pull request. When Gogs processes that pull request with the rebase merge option, it passes the branch name directly to git rebase, which interprets --exec as a legitimate flag. That flag tells Git to run a shell command after every rebase step. The attacker's command runs as the Gogs server process user. This is called argument injection. It's a subtle class of vulnerability because it doesn't use the classic shell meta characters that most input sanitization routines are designed to catch. No semicolons, no pipes, no ampersands. Just a flag that changes how a legitimate tool behaves. The attack requires a Gogs account, so it's not unauthenticated. But in many Gogs deployments, that's a very low bar. Open registration, community contributors, CI/CD service accounts, any of those can trigger this. And once the command runs, the attacker has code execution as the Gogs process user with access to every repository on that server. Rapid7 reported this on March 17th. They followed responsible disclosure norms, they waited the standard window, sent multiple follow-up attempts, and got nothing back. So they went public. The Gogs project has historically had a small maintainer team and a slow release cadence. This isn't the first time a security report has gone unanswered. So, what do you do right now? First, go into every Gogs repository and disable rebase before merging. That's in repository settings under repository. Second, restrict pull request permissions to trusted contributors only. Third, audit your Gogs process user. It should be running as a low privilege account, not root. If it's running as root, the blast radius of exploitation is your entire server. And then there's the bigger question. When a project goes silent on a critical security report for 10 weeks, is it time to migrate? We'll get to that. But first, let's talk about something that does have a patch. Samba is the software that lets Linux servers talk to Windows clients. It is the reason your Linux file server shows up in Windows Explorer. It handles SMB, CISA, and a range of other protocols that are deeply embedded in enterprise environments. And this week, it received a critical security update that you need to apply immediately. The most serious vulnerability in this patch is CVE 2026-4480. It is a remote code execution flaw in Samba's printing subsystem. The vulnerability exists because Samba fails to properly escape job descriptions before passing them to the underlying print handling code. An attacker who can submit a print job, which in many environments means any authenticated network user, can inject commands into that job description and have them executed on the server. There is a second RCE in this update as well, CVE 2026-4408. Which affects the SAMR protocol. SAMR is the Security Account Manager Remote Protocol, used for user and group management operations. This one also allows remote code execution under certain conditions. Now the good news here is that patches are available. Alma Linux pushed ALSA 2026-22963 on June 4th. Fedora has Samba 4.2.4.3 in the repos. Debian and Ubuntu have their own advisories. The vendors moved quickly once the upstream Samba project released the fixes. The commands you need are straightforward. On RHEL-based systems, that is Alma Linux, Rocky Linux, Oracle Linux, and Fedora, run sudo dnf update Samba. On Debian and Ubuntu, sudo apt-get update, followed by sudo apt-get install Samba. A lot of administrators treat Samba as a background service, something that was set up years ago and just runs. It is not glamorous, it is not the kind of thing you think about until something breaks. But Samba runs as a privileged service. It handles authentication, and it is often exposed to every device on your network. A remote code execution vulnerability in Samba is not a theoretical risk. It is a direct path to your file server. If you have not updated Samba this week, stop watching this video, open a terminal, and run the update. Then come back. I will wait. Now, let us talk about something that is a bit more subtle. A vulnerability in the Linux kernel itself that was quietly published to the NVD on June 3rd. Chapter 4 of 8, CVE-2026-46259, the race condition hiding in /proc. Every running process on a Linux system has an entry in the /proc file system. You can read /proc/pit/stat to get information about any process, its state, its parent, its CPU usage. It's a standard interface, it's been there for decades. And this week, a use after free vulnerability was published that lives right inside the kernel function that handles those reads. CVE-2026-46259 was published to the National Vulnerability Database on June 3rd. The vulnerability is in do taskstat, which is the kernel function that reads /proc/pit/stat entries. Here's the problem. The function reads a pointer to the parent task. Task arrow real _ parent, without holding the correct lock. In the Linux kernel, the mechanism for protecting shared data accessed by multiple CPU cores is called RCU, or Read, Copy, Update. The rule is simple. If you're going to dereference a pointer that another CPU might be freeing, you need to hold the RCU read lock around the entire operation, both the load of the pointer and its dereference. Do task stat loads the parent pointer outside the RCU lock, then passes it to another function that acquires the lock internally. But by the time that inner lock is acquired, another CPU may have already freed the parent task structure. The result is a use after free. The kernel dereferences memory that has been freed, which can lead to memory corruption, information disclosure, or, in the worst case, privilege escalation. The fix is elegant in its simplicity. The upstream kernel patch replaces the vulnerable function call with one that performs the parent lookup entirely inside a proper RCU protected region. The patch has been merged across multiple stable kernel branches. Now, this is not the easiest vulnerability to exploit. It requires a race condition on a multi-core system, and there's no public proof of concept code available at the time of this recording. But use after free vulnerabilities in the kernel have historically been weaponized by skilled attackers, particularly in containerized environments where unprivileged users have access to /proc. The mitigation is straightforward. First, update your kernel. Your distribution should have the fix available. Second, if you're running multi-tenant systems or container hosts where unprivileged users shouldn't be able to see each other's processes, mount /proc with the hide EPD = 2 option. That restricts process visibility, so unprivileged users can only see their own processes. To make it persistent across reboots, add this to your /etc/fstab. proc defaults, hide PID = 2, GID = proc00. This is the kind of vulnerability that doesn't make headlines the way a 0-day does. It's a quiet NVD publication on a Tuesday. But kernel use after free vulnerabilities are exactly the type of flaw that ends up in exploit chains, combined with an initial foothold to escalate privileges all the way to root. Keep your kernels updated. On June 2nd, CISA, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, added CVE-2022-0492 to its Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog. That is the official list of vulnerabilities that CISA has confirmed are being actively exploited in the wild. The federal patching deadline was June 5th. Now, you might be thinking, this CVE is from 2022. Why are we talking about it in 2026? That is exactly the right question. And the answer tells you something important about how real-world attacks actually work. CVE-2022-0492 is a privilege escalation vulnerability in the C group's V1 subsystem of the Linux kernel. Control groups, C groups, are the kernel mechanism that containerization technologies like Docker and Kubernetes use to isolate and limit resources for containers. The vulnerability is in the C group release agent write function, which handles a specific type of notification when a C group is released. Due to insufficient authentication checks, an attacker inside a container can abuse this function to escape the container and gain root-level access on the host system. The kernel patches for this were released back in 2022, but CISA's addition to the KEV catalog in June 2026 tells us that threat actors are still actively exploiting this against unpatched systems. And that is the uncomfortable reality of enterprise Linux environments. Not everyone is running the latest kernel. Long-running systems, legacy deployments, and cloud instances that have not been rebooted in months. These are the targets. Kernel patches shipped 2022. KEV edition, June 2nd, 2026. That is a 4-year gap. If you're running containers, whether that is Docker, Podman, or Kubernetes, you need to verify 2 things. First, that your kernel is updated to a version that includes the C group's V1 fix. Second, if you are still using C group's V1, consider migrating to C group's V2, which has significantly better isolation properties and does not carry this class of vulnerability. To check which C group version your system is using, run stat-f c%t/sys/f/s/c group/. If the output is tmpfs, you are on C group's V1. If it is C group 2fs, you are on V2. Most mono distributions default to V2 now, but all the systems and some cloud images still use V1. By the way, I just checked the channel analytics and it turns out a significant portion of you watching right now are not subscribed yet. If you have been getting value from these Linux security deep dives, hitting that subscribe button is the best free way to support the channel and make sure you do not miss the next one. The bell icon is right there. Now, we have covered 4 vulnerabilities this week. But there is a thread connecting the Gogs story to something broader that I want to address directly. We asked earlier, when does a vendor silence on a critical security report become a reason to migrate away from their software entirely? Let's answer that. The Gogs 0-day raises a question that goes beyond this specific vulnerability. It is a question every Linux administrator and DevOps engineer should have a framework for. When does an open source project's security posture become a liability that outweighs its utility? Here is the honest assessment of Gogs. The project has historically had a small core team and a slow release cadence. The last stable release predates many modern security practices. And the maintainer's complete silence in response to Rapid7's responsible disclosure attempt over 10 weeks is not just a process failure. It is a signal about the project's capacity to respond to future security reports. That does not mean Gogs is malicious or that the maintainers are negligent people. Small open source projects often do not have the bandwidth to respond to security reports in a timely manner. This is a structural challenge across the self-hosted Git ecosystem. But from a risk management perspective, running software with a known critical vulnerability and no patch timeline is not a defensible position. The good news is that the migration path from Gogs is well documented. Git is a community fork of Gogs with an active maintainer team and a strong security response record. Forgeo is a community maintained fork of Git with a focus on governance and independence from commercial interests. Both are functionally equivalent to Gogs and support direct data migration. The broader principle here is worth stating clearly. When you're evaluating open source software, security responsiveness should be a first-class criterion alongside features and performance. The Open SSF Security Scorecards project was specifically designed to surface this risk before you commit to a dependency. It scores projects on criteria like code review practices, vulnerability disclosure processes, and update frequency. It is worth running against any project you're considering deploying in a security-sensitive environment. For Gogs specifically, Disable rebase merge today. Restrict access and put a migration to Gitty or Fortio on your roadmap. Do not wait for a patch that may never come. Now, let's zoom out and look at the distribution level picture for this week, because there is a broader pattern in the advisories that is worth understanding. The 4 stories we've covered today don't exist in isolation. This week was a significant patching cycle across every major Linux distribution. Let's run through the broader picture quickly, because there are a few items here that may affect your specific environment. Alma Linux pushed a substantial batch of updates on June 3rd and 4th. Beyond Samba and the kernel, the notable ones are OpenSSL, 2 separate advisories, ALSA-2026:22312 and ALSA-2026:22314, covering moderate severity issues in the cryptography library that underpins most of your encrypted traffic. Apache HTTP server also received an important update, ALSA-2026:22140, covering the HTTP D2.4 module stack. If you're running Alma Linux as a web server, both of those need attention. Debian had a busy week as well. The standout is DSA-6323-1, the Apache 2 security update, which mirrors the HTTPD fixes in RHEL. Debian also patched Dovecot DSA-6313-1, which is the IMAP and POP3 server used by many self-hosted mail setups. If you're running a Debian-based mail server, Dovecot needs to be updated. There's also DLA-4614-1 for sudo, which is always worth paying attention to given sudo's privileged position in every Linux system. Ubuntu's USN 83891, published June 4th, covers multiple kernel vulnerabilities across Ubuntu 18.04, 20.04 and 22.04 LTS. This is separate from the XM advisory we mentioned earlier. If you're running Ubuntu LTS on servers, you want both of these updates applied. SUSE had its own significant week. The SUSE Update Advisories page shows a security update for multi-Linux manager client tools, plus the ongoing glibc updates that include a heap overflow vulnerability in scanf pattern processing. If you're running SUSE Linux Enterprise or OpenSUSE, check your update queue. Fedora pushed Nginx to version 1.30.2 with security fixes, updated Dovecot to 2.4.4 and patched postfix. If you're running Fedora on a server, which is less common but not unheard of, those 3 services cover a significant portion of typical server workloads. The pattern across all of these advisories is consistent. Web servers, mail servers, cryptography libraries, and the kernel itself. These are the foundational layers of Linux infrastructure. The volume of advisories this week is above average, and the severity distribution skews toward important and critical, rather than moderate. The practical takeaway is straightforward. Run your package manager this week. Not next week, not after the weekend, today. The window between a patch release and active exploitation has been shrinking consistently over the past few years. Automated scanning tools find unpatched systems within hours of a CVE publication. Which brings us to the final question, and the one I promised to answer at the start of this video. What's the actual process for staying on top of this without it consuming your entire week? The volume of security advisories we've covered today can feel overwhelming. 4 major stories, dozens of distribution advisories, multiple CVEs. If you're a solo administrator or a small team, the question isn't just, what do I patch? It's, how do I build a process that makes this manageable without burning out? Here's the framework I'd suggest. First, subscribe to the security advisory feeds for your specific distributions. Every major distribution, Ubuntu, Alma Linux, Debian, Fedora, SUSE, publishes a security mailing list or RSS feed. Set up a filter in your email client that flags anything marked critical or important. That's your daily 5-minute check. Second, subscribe to the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerabilities feed. CISA publishes an RSS feed and a JSON API for the KEB catalog. When something gets added to that list, it means active exploitation is confirmed. That's your highest priority queue. Anything on KEV gets patched within 24 hours, regardless of whether it's a weekend. Third, for unpatched 0 days, like the Gogs situation, where there's no vendor fix available, your response is mitigation and monitoring. Disable the vulnerable feature, restrict access, and watch the project's issue tracker and release page for a patch. Set a calendar reminder to check weekly. If a patch doesn't appear within a reasonable time frame, that's your trigger to evaluate migration. Fourth, automate where you can. Tools like unattended upgrades on Debian and Ubuntu or DNF automatic on real-based systems can handle security updates automatically for lower risk packages. Reserve your manual attention for critical and important severity updates that require testing before deployment. The goal isn't to read every advisory. The goal is to build a system that surfaces the things that actually require your attention and handles the rest automatically. This week's Linux security picture is a good illustration of why that system matters. An unpatched 0-day in a widely used Git service. A critical RCE in Samba, a kernel used after free. A 4-year-old container escape that's still being actively exploited. None of these are exotic nation-state level attacks. They're the kind of vulnerabilities that show up in every organization's environment, and they're being exploited by automated tools within days of disclosure. The good news is that the Linux ecosystem's response to these vulnerabilities has been fast. Distribution vendors pushed patches within days of upstream disclosure. The tools to protect your systems are available right now. The only variable is whether you apply them. If you found this breakdown useful, there's a related video on the channel that goes deeper into container security and cgroups v2 migration. That's directly relevant to the CVE 2022-0492 story we covered today. The link is on screen right now. If you're getting value from these weekly security roundups, subscribe and hit the bell. That's the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a pseudo user or get root access. It genuinely helps keep this content going. Sign up for the weekly newsletter at tondoeslinux.com/newsletter. I send a written version of these security roundups every week with all the commands and links in one place.